Midnight struck 12, and the house exhaled a sound like wet parchment tearing. William King stood in the decaying foyer of Blackwood Manor, the scent of damp stone and forgotten blood thick enough to taste copper and decay. His hands, still trembling from the last patient's final, wet gasp 3 weeks ago, gripped the cold iron banister. He'd been a medic, once, stitching wounds in war zones, not haunted houses. But the hospital board had called him foot unstable, after the incident with the child who'd stopped breathing while he held her hand. Now Blackwood was his only inheritance, a tomb of gargoyle shadows and whispering draughts. The rain lashed the leaded windows like desperate fingers. He needed sleep. He needed to forget the hollow look in that child's eyes. The cat emerged from the darkness beneath the grand staircase. Not a stray, but a fixture of the manor, its fur the color of old bruises, unnervingly fuzzy, despite the pervasive damp. It moved with a silent, deliberate grace that felt less like a cat and more like a shadow given form. William had named it Marmalade, a joke from his past life, but the name felt like a lie now. The cat paused, its head tilted at an impossible angle, 2 points of cold light where eyes should be. It didn't purr, it simply fudged him, the silence pressing in like a physical weight. William's breath hitched, the air smelled suddenly of ozone and something else, like the metallic tang of a fresh wound, but deeper, older. He turned away, forcing himself toward the master bedroom, the one with the cracked window overlooking the overgrown corpse-like rose garden. The floorboards groaned beneath his worn boots, each creak a promise of the next one giving way. He needed to barricade the door. The cat followed, its silent steps a counterpoint to the frantic drumming of his own heart. Just a cat, he told himself, the mantra brittle as old bone. Just a scared animal in a scary house. But the way it moved, too smooth, too still, chilled him more than the manor's perpetual chill. He remembered the child's small hand going limp in his own, the terrifying silence after the last gasp. He'd been a medic, trained to save lives, not to feel the life leach out of a tiny body under his touch. The guilt was a physical thing, a cold stone in his gut. He reached the bedroom, the air inside thick with the scent of mildew and something faintly sweet, like rotting lilies. He fumbled with the heavy bolt, his fingers numb. The cat didn't enter. It stopped just inside the threshold, its fussy fur catching the dim moonlight filtering through the grimy window. It raised one paw, not to scratch, but to point, not at him but at the wall behind him. William froze. The wall was bare stone, cold and rough. Nothing there. He turned slowly, his muscles locked with dread. The only thing on the wall was a single fresh scratch, deep and precise, carved into the plaster. It looked like a claw mark, but the cat hadn't moved its paw. The scratch was new. The cat's eyes, those unblinking voids, held his for a long, silent moment. Then it turned and vanished back into the darkness of the hall, leaving only the echo of its silent passage and the chilling certainty that the house was not empty. It was waiting. It had been waiting for 12. The clock in the hall, its hands frozen at midnight, seemed to pulse with a slow, wet rhythm. William stood alone in the suffocating dark, the taste of copper sharp on his tongue, realizing the medic's hands that once saved lives were now too shaky to even close a door. The house had claimed its new patient, and the cat was the first to greet it. The scratch on the wall wasn't the first thing to move. It was the first thing, sound-end, that came next, a wet, grinding, shifting from the plaster behind William King's head, like stone grinding against stone in a slow, deliberate throat. He just slammed the heavy oak door shut, the bolt sliding home with a metallic plack he'd hoped would be final now. The house breathed around him, the ancient timbers sighing like a dying man. The cat sat on the floorboards before the door, its matted fur like old blood, not watching him, but twatchy listening to the walls. Its eyes, 2 points of frozen mercury, reflected the single guttering candle William had lit. Not a cat, he thought. The medic's analytical mind fighting the primal terror, not a living thing. The air tasted of ozone and the coppery tang of old blood, thick enough to choke on. He dragged the heavy wardrobe against the door, its legs scraping the floorboards with a sound like breaking bones. Solid, safe. The candlelight flickered, throwing monstrous, leaping shadows that didn't match the room's shape. The cat rose, moving with a fluid, boneless grace that made William's stomach clench. It padded to the wall where the scratch marred the plaster, its nose almost touching the deep groove. Then it foot-twitched. Not with a claw, but with a slow, deliberate pressure of its entire paw, deepening the mark, drawing a new line parallel to the old one. The sound was wet, like a knife dragging through damp clay. William's breath hitched. The house groaned again, a deeper vibration this time. The floorboards beneath his feet suddenly warm, almost to PVT suddenly warm. The candle flame dipped violently, plunging the room into near darkness before flaring back to life. In that split second of shadow, he saw the wall shribble. Not a shadow, but the plaster itself seeming to swell then recede, like a slow, wet pulse. He stumbled back, his heel catching the leg of the bedside table. It crashed to the floor, the sound sharp and final in the oppressive silence. The cat didn't flinch. It turned its head, those mercury eyes fixed on William, and Phimemio Dudavin. Not a cat's sound. It was a dry, rasping scrape, like stone on stone, layered with something else, a wet, guttural click that echoed the house's own grinding. The sound vibrated in William's teeth. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of wet earth, and something sweetly rotten, like forgotten lilies blooming in a tomb. The scratch on the wall began to footy with a faint, internal light, not warm but cold, like the glow of deep-sea vents. The cat padded towards him, not fleeing the sound, but teven towards. It its head low, ears flattened. William's hand shook violently as he fumbled for the small, cold weight of the emergency medical kit he'd brought, a useless relic now, a mockery of his past life. The cat stopped inches from his boots, its nose twitching. It didn't look at him. It looked through him towards the wall. The pulse in the plaster intensified, a slow, wet throb that matched the frantic drumming in William's own chest. The house wasn't just haunted. It was somebody digesting. The silence, the emptiness, the 40 patient waiting. The cat lifted its head, its throat making that same wet, clicking sound, and William understood with chilling clarity the truth the house had been whispering since midnight. The child's death wasn't an accident. It was a prelude. The house had been waiting for him. The cat was the usher, and the next patient was already breathing in the walls. The candle guttered, the last flicker of light swallowed by the cold, wet dark that had always been there, waiting for him to stop running. The house didn't just breathe. It tweetive. William King pressed his forehead against the cold, damp plaster of the bedroom wall, the pulse beneath his skin matching the slow, wet throb emanating from the scratch. It wasn't a vibration, it was a voice-king sound, like a wound drawing air. The cat sat beside the wardrobe he'd shoved against the door, its fur now seeming less like bruised velvet and more like dried sun-bleached bone. It watched him, those mercury eyes reflecting the guttering candle's feeble light, but its head was tilted toward the wall, ears flattened in a way that wasn't feline. It's guiding me, he realized, the medic's clinical detachment fraying into raw panic, not to safety, to the wound. He stumbled to the bedside table, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the emergency kit. Useless, just like his hands had been with the child. He fumbled for the candle, its wax dripping like tears onto the floorboards, the smell of wet earth and rotting lilies thick enough to choke on. The wall's pulse intensified, a visible ripple in the plaster, the scratch deepening into a jagged wet groove. The cold, wet light from within the wall pulsed, casting shifting shadows that didn't belong to the room. Not light. Decay. It smelled like the inside of a tomb after rain. The cat padded silently across the floorboards, its claws making no sound on the wood, heading straight for the wall. It didn't scratch. It nudged the plaster with its nose, a soft, deliberate pressure. The wall yielded slightly, a small section of plaster crumbling inward like rotten fruit. William's breath stopped. Inside the hollow nestled against the damp stone lay a small water-stained journal, its pages brittle as old skin. The cover was plain, the leather cracked, but the words were written in a child's neat hand, the ink faded to a rusty brown. He snatched it, his hand shaking violently. The pages felt like damp parchment, the words bleeding into the paper where water had seeped through the manor's ancient walls. "Mr. King is kind," the first entry read, "but the house is hungry. It wants the quiet one. It wants the one who holds still." The next line was smudged, as if written in haste or by a trembling hand. "He saved me from the dark, but the house saved me for him. It's a gift. Please, don't let it be me next. It's in the walls." William's stomach lurched. Futhi the child. Not an accident! A gift. The house had chosen him. The child had known. The journal fell from his numb fingers, the brittle pages scattering like dead leaves. The cat didn't look at him. It stood before the wall, its head raised, its throat making that wet, clicking sound again, a sound like stone grinding in a deep well. The wall pulsed brighter, the cold light now illuminating the jagged scratch with a sickly wet luminescence. The house wasn't just waiting, it was digesting. The silence, the fear, the 20 nexting life. The cat turned its head, those mercury eyes locking onto William's. Not with menace, but with a terrifying ancient frightcognition. It had been the usher. Now it was the witness. The house had claimed the child, it had claimed the medic. And the journal's final, smudged line, written in the child's hand, seemed to whisper in the suffocating air, "It's his turn. The quiet one is coming." William looked at his hands. The hands that had stitched wounds held a child's lifeless body, now trembling over a journal that confirmed his own impending death. The candle flickered one last time, casting the cat's shadow large and monstrous on the wall, its form merging with the pulsing, wet light. The house exhaled, a sound like a slow, wet breath filling the room, and the cat began to move toward him, not away. Its padded steps were silent on the floorboards, but the sound of the wall's pulse was louder now, a deep, wet drumming in his bones. The cat's nose touched his ankle, cold and dry as old bone, and William understood. The house had never been haunted. It had been Shrialevi, and it had just finished its first course. The next course was arriving. The cat's eyes, reflecting the cold, wet light, held no fear. Only the patient, ancient hunger of the walls themselves. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full, and it was waiting for him to stop breathing. The journal's final line wasn't smudged. It was written in fresh ink, the letters sharp and wet against the brittle page. "It's his turn. The quiet one is coming." William's breath fogged in the suddenly frigid air, each exhale tasting of grave soil and the copper tang of old blood. The cat stood before him, its fur now the color of dried riverbeds, not bruised velvet. It didn't look at the scattered pages, it looked through the wall, where the pulse had intensified into a deep, wet drumming vibrating up through the floorboards into his bones. The house was no longer waiting. It was twist-digesting him, the fear, the guilt, the very air he choked on. The cold, wet light from the wall pulsed brighter, casting the cat's shadow large and distorted on the ceiling, its form merging with the throbbing darkness. William stumbled backward, his shoulder hitting the cold stone of the wall. The plaster beneath his palm felt warm, earthy alive, like the skin of a wound. The drumming grew louder, a rhythmic thump-thump that echoed the frantic beat of his own heart, but deeper, wetter, like a slow heartbeat inside the wall. The cat padded forward, silent as falling dust, its head low, ears flat against its skull in a posture that felt less like feline and more like a predator's focused stillness. It stopped inches from his trembling hand, the tip of its nose brushing the cold metal of the emergency kit he dropped. Not a warning. An invitation. The house's hunger was a physical thing now, pressing against his skin, smelling of damp stone and the sweet rot of forgotten lilies. He looked down at the journal. The child's words weren't a warning. They were a receipt. The house hadn't just claimed the child. It had chosen William, the quiet one, the one who held still, who didn't fight the darkness, who let the life leach out of tiny hands, his hands, the hands that had failed. The house had been waiting for him since the child's death, a patient long overdue. The cat lifted its head, those mercury points reflecting the cold light, and made that wet, clicking sound again. Not a sound, but a vibration. In the air, a sound that resonated with the drumming in the wall. It wasn't a call. It was a for confirmation. The wall directly before him began to soy-breathe. Plaster cracked and crumbled inward, with a sound like dry bones snapping, revealing not stone, but a deeper, wet darkness. It smelled of cold earth and stagnant water, thick enough to coat the tongue. The drumming emanated from within the hollow, a slow, wet tiffant thump that matched the frantic rhythm in William's chest. The cat didn't hesitate. It stepped to Antor. The darkness, its form dissolving into the wet shadow, leaving only the echo of its silent passage and the deepening pulse. Was showing him the way. William's legs locked. He saw the child's small, limp hand in his mind, the terrifying silence after the last gasp. He'd been a medic. He'd stitched wounds, held lives now. The house wanted his quiet. It wanted the one who didn't fight. The journal's words echoed. It's his turn. It was Sooty Alive, a slow, patient predator that had been waiting in the walls since the first death, since the first quiet one had stopped breathing. It had been feeding on silence, on the absence of sound, on the final stillness. The drumming grew louder, shaking the floorboards beneath his feet. The cold, wet light pulsed, illuminating the jagged opening in the wall like a slow, wet heartbeat. The cat was gone, but its presence lingered in the air, a silent usher. William's hands, the hands that had failed the child, were now shaking violently, useless. He couldn't run, the house had him. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of the wet, hungry pulse of the walls themselves. The house had finished its first course, Now it was ready for the main course, the quiet one. His turn. He took a single, shuddering step toward the pulsing darkness, the taste of copper sharp on his tongue, the sound of the wall's wet drumming filling his skull, drowning out the frantic drumming of his own heart. The cat had led him to the door. The house was opening. And William King, the medic who couldn't save the quiet one, was finally ready to be the next patient. The silence wasn't waiting anymore. It was sword, eating. The wall didn't just open, it swallowed him whole. William King stepped through the jagged, wet aperture, the cold, damp stone dissolving against his skin like melting ice. The cat followed, its form dissolving into the darkness ahead, leaving only the echo of its silent passage and the deep, wet foofth of the house's pulse vibrating through his bones. The air thickened, tasting of wet stone, and the metallic whisper of old blood pressing in like a slow, suffocating tide. He stumbled forward, not on floorboards, but on something yielding and warm, like the inside of a wound. The cat's mercury eyes glowed faintly ahead, guiding him deeper into the manor's living core. The walls weren't stone, they were tissue, veins of cold, wet luminescence pulsed beneath the surface, mapping the house's slow, patient hunger. The drumming wasn't just in the walls. It was Sophie inside him now, a rhythmic thrumming in his chest cavity, matching the house's own slow heartbeat. He saw the child's small hand again. Not limp, but too sinking, dissolving into the wall's wet embrace, her final breath a silent sigh absorbed by the damp plaster. The house hadn't just claimed her life. It had fully consumed her quietness, her stillness. And now it was diagnosing him. Hufurti, the quiet one. The one who holds still, the one who failed to save, Hufurti, the cat stopped before a larger, darker void in the pulsing wall. It turned its head, those mercury points fixed on William, not with menace, but with the ancient, patient recognition of a surgeon about to begin an operation. It didn't meow. It pressed its head against the wet surface, and the wall yielded like soft, cold clay. Beyond lay a chamber of pure, suffocating darkness, smelling of deep earth, and the sweet, cloying rot of lilies blooming in a tomb. The drumming here was louder, a physical force shaking his teeth, a sound like bone grinding in a slow, wet well. The house was breathing him in. William's hands, the hands that had stitched wounds and failed to hold life, trembled violently. He thought of the emergency kit, useless now, a relic of a life the house had already consumed. He thought of the child's final silent gasp, the sound he'd been trying to drown out for weeks. The house hadn't been waiting for a ghost. It had been waiting for Haifing, the quiet one who finally stopped fighting the silence. The journal's receipt was a diagnosis, Patient William King, symptoms, guilt, stillness. Failure to sustain life. The house had been preparing him, feeding on his fear, his guilt, his very quiet for weeks. The cat was the usher, the house was the surgeon, and the operation was complete. He took a step into the void. The darkness wasn't empty. It was void for him. It felt like sinking into a warm, wet grave. The drumming now a part of his own pulse. The cat padded beside him, its fur now the color of dried riverbeds. No sound of claws on the yielding wall. It raised its head, those mercury eyes reflecting the house's wet luminescence, and made that wet, clicking vibration, not a sound, but a confirmation in the marrow of his bones. Yes, this is the quiet one. This is the patient. What the house exhaled, not air. A slow, wet breath that filled his lungs, thick with the taste of grave soil and the coppery tang of old blood. The drumming ceased. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was Tweed, satisfied. The cat pressed its cold, dry nose against his ankle, a silent farewell, a final ushering. William King, the medic who couldn't save the quiet one, finally stopped fighting. He stopped breathing. The house had its next course. The silence was full, and it was finally utterly quiet. The cat turned, vanished into the pulsing wall, leaving only the wet, slow futhi of the house's satisfied heart, and the deep, silent breath of the patient who had finally become still. The house didn't just wear William King, it crew him. His bones settled into the wall's slow, wet rhythm, the drumming now a part of his own marrow. The taste of grave soil and copper thickened in his throat, no longer a memory but his new breath. His skin lost its sharp edges, blurring into the wall's damp, luminous tissue, veins of cold light tracing where his veins once pulsed. The cat wasn't a separate thing anymore. It was the house's own pulse made visible, a slow, cold vibration in the wall's surface, like a single point of focus in the endless dark. It didn't move toward the door. It went to see. The door's hinge, the silent click that opened the way. The house exhaled, a deep wet sigh that wasn't sound but pressure against the bones of the new patient. William felt his own stillness deepen, not as a failure, but as a gifted the house had been waiting for. The quiet one wasn't someone who stopped breathing. He was someone who became the silence. The journal's words were no longer a receipt. They were the house's own heartbeat. Patient William King. Diagnosis, stillness, treatment, assimilation. The cat's vibration intensified. A silent pulse radiating from the wall where William's hand had once been. It wasn't a guide now. It was the house's own recognition. The moment it knew the next quiet one had arrived outside the manor, rain fell like cold tears on the corpse. A figure stood at the gate, shoulders hunched against the storm, a small bundle clutched to their chest. A medic, perhaps, or a mother. The house felt the tremor of their breath before the knock. Not a sound! A fissure in the walls, a slow, wet tampe that matched the rhythm of the figure's own frantic pulse. The cat's vibration shifted, flowing toward the front door, not as a cat but as the house's own nerve ending. The wall rippled, not with a scratch, but with a slow, deliberate thudding unfurling, like a wound opening to receive. The figure knocked 3 times. Soft, hesitant. The house didn't wait for the sound to fade. It answered. The front door, which had never opened for anyone, swung inward with a groan of wet wood. Not a draft, but a slow, sucking breath pulling the figure inside. The cat's vibration pulsed brighter, a cold, wet light flaring in the wall's texture, where William's face had been. It was guiding them. The house's hunger now a physical thing pressing against the figure's skin, smelling of damp stone and the sweet rot of lilies blooming in a tomb. The figure stumbled into the foyer, the bundle forgotten at their feet. It wasn't a child. A small, water-stained journal, its pages brittle as old skin. The house recognized the weight of it, the same weight as William's. The cat's vibration deepened, a slow, wet thrumming that resonated in the figure's teeth. The house had been waiting for this, the quiet one who held still. The one who didn't fight the silence. The one who let the life leach out. The figure looked around, eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes after a child's final, silent gasp. They saw the wall where William had been, now smooth, luminous, pulsing with cold light. They saw the cat, not a cat, but the house's own slow, patient heartbeat made visible. It didn't meow, it vibrated. A sound felt more than heard, a confirmation in the marrow. The house's hunger was no longer a whisper. It was the sound of the figure's own breath catching, the wet drumming in their chest matching the wall's pulse. The house exhaled, a deep, wet sigh that filled the figure's lungs, thick with the taste of old blood and the scent of rain on dead earth. The cat's vibration pulsed once, a final silent ushering. The figure didn't run, they didn't fight, they stopped there. Their shoulders dropped. The bundle slid from their hands, hitting the floorboards with a soft final thud. The house didn't need to consume them, it only needed them to fish him. The quiet one had arrived. The house's hunger was satisfied, not with a meal, but with the deep, wet silence of a life, finally, utterly quiet. The cat's vibration faded into the wall, leaving only the house's slow, satisfied drumming and the deep, silent breath of the new patient, already becoming part of the walls. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full, and it was waiting for the next knock. The house breathed in the new silence. Not air, but the slow, wet inhalation of a wound closing over a still body. The figure stood frozen in the foyer, the bundle forgotten at their feet, a small, water-stained journal identical to William's. The cat's vibration pulsed from the wall where William's face had been, a cold, wet thrumming that resonated in the figure's molars. It wasn't a sound, it was the house's own pulse, now amplified through the new patient. The figure's breath hitched, shallow and frantic, a sound the house had been starving for. Too loud. The walls seemed to whisper. Too much noise. They tried to move, to flee toward the door, but the floorboards beneath their feet felt like warm, yielding flesh. The damp stone scent deepened, thick with the cloying rot of lilies blooming in a tomb, coating their tongue with the taste of wet earth and old blood. The cat's vibration intensified, a slow, wet drumming against the figure's skin, not threatening but twigidine, pulling them deeper into the manor's core. The house wasn't waiting anymore. It was digesting, the sound of their fear, the frantic rhythm of their heart. The journal lay open on the floor, its brittle pages whispering the same words William had read. The quiet one is coming, is coming. The figure's eyes darted to the wall, where the cold, wet luminescence pulsed, mapping the house's hunger. They saw William's absence not as loss, but as puny completion. They stopped struggling. The frantic drumming in their chest slowed, matching the wall's wet rhythm. Their shoulders dropped, a physical surrender. The bundles slid from their hands, hitting the floorboards with a soft final thud. Not a child, but a small, damp cloth, smelling of rain and forgotten lilies. The house exhaled, a deep, wet sigh that filled their lungs, thick with the scent of grave soil. The cat's vibration softened, no longer a pulse, but a gentle thrumming in the wall's texture, like the slow beat of a heart settling into stillness. The figure didn't fall. They melted tea. Fingers lost their sharp edges, blurring into the wall's luminous tissue. Veins of cold light traced the path where their veins once pulsed, spreading like frost on glass. The copper taste in their throat deepened, becoming their own breath. They felt the house's slow, wet rhythm seep into their marrow, not as hunger, but as hunt recognition. The quiet one wasn't someone who stopped breathing. They were someone who became the silence. The journal's words weren't a warning, they were the house's own heartbeat. The patient stillness, assimilation far, the cat's vibration faded into the wall, leaving only the house's deep, satisfied drumming. The figure's final breath wasn't a gasp, but a sigh absorbed by the damp plaster. The house exhaled once more, a slow, wet pulse that shook the floorboards. The front door, which had never opened, now stood slightly ajar, a dark mouth waiting in the rain-lashed night. Outside, the corpse, like rose garden, dripped with cold water, each petal a tiny wet tomb. The house had finished its course. The silence was full, and it was perfectly, utterly quiet. The cat wasn't a cat. It was the house's slow, patient heartbeat made visible, now a single point of cold light in the wall, waiting for the next knock. The next quiet one. The house didn't need to hunt, it only needed to hoo-hoot, be still, and the world would bring its next patient to the door. The drumming ceased, the silence was no longer empty. It was the house's new, satisfied breath. And it was waiting. The knock came not as sound, but as pressure against the damp plaster. A slow, wet footstep that vibrated up through the floorboards into the marrow of the new patient outside. Rain lashed the corpse, like rose garden, each petal dripping with cold, dead water. The house exhaled, a deep, wet sigh that filled the foyer with the scent of grave soil and the copper tang of old blood, now the new patient's own breath. The cat's vibration pulsed from the wall where William's face had been, a slow, cold thrumming that resonated in the latest arrival's molars. It wasn't a warning, it was the house's heartbeat, amplified through fresh stillness. The figure stood frozen, shoulders hunched against the storm, a small bundle clutched to their chest. They'd come for the child, not knowing they carried the house's next course. The journal lay forgotten at their feet, its brittle pages whispering, "Foot in the quiet one is coming." The house recognized the weight of their fear, the same weight as William's, as the last patient's. It didn't hunger for screams. It craved the shooty absence of sound. The figure's breath hitched, shallow and frantic. Too loud, the walls seemed to sigh. The house began to digest the sound, the wet drumming in the plaster, deepening to match the figure's accelerating pulse. The floorboards beneath their feet softened, yielding like warm, dissolving flesh. The damp stone scent thickened, coating their tongue with the taste of stagnant water and forgotten lilies. The cat's vibration intensified, not as a guide but as the house's own recognition. It flowed through the wall, a single point of cold light pulsing where the figure's eyes had been. The figure's hands trembled, the bundles slipping from their grasp, a small, water-stained cloth smelling of rain and decay. They tried to step back, but the wall embraced them, its luminous tissue spreading like frost on glass. Fingers blurred, losing their sharp edges, becoming part of the house's slow, wet rhythm. Veins of cold luminescence traced the path where their veins had pulsed, spreading inward. The copper taste in their throat deepened, becoming their new breath. The house didn't need to pull them in. It only needed them to stop fighting. The frantic drumming in their chests slowed, matching the wall's wet pulse. Shoulders dropped. The bundle hit the floorboards with a soft final thud, not a child but the cloth now soaked with rain and the house's own dampness. The house exhaled again, a deep, wet sigh that filled their lungs, thick with the scent of rain on dead earth. The cat's vibration softened, no longer a pulse but a gentle thrumming in the wall's texture, like a heart settling into stillness. The figure didn't fall. They melted. The house absorbed the last tremor of fear, the final gasp of resistance. The journal's words weren't a warning anymore. They were the house's own heartbeat, patient, stillness, assimilation. Assimilation. The front door, which had never opened for anyone, now stood slightly ajar, a dark mouth waiting in the rain. Lashed night. Outside, the rose garden dripped with cold water, each petal a tiny wet tomb. The house's hunger was no longer a whisper. It was the deep, wet silence of a life fully surrendered. The cat's vibration faded into the wall, leaving only the house's slow, satisfied drumming, the sound of the quiet one finally becoming part of the walls. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, and it was waiting. The next knock would come soon. The house didn't hunt. It only needed to be still, and the world would bring its next patient to the door. The drumming ceased. The silence was no longer a void. It was a presence, a home. The house had claimed its newest guest, and the cat, now just a point of cold light in the wall, was the only witness to the quiet. The house breathed. It was full, and it was perfectly, utterly quiet. The house didn't just wait for the next knock. It began counting the seconds between them. Rain lashed the corpse, like rose garden, each petal dripping a slow, cold tear onto the soaked earth. Inside, the silence was no longer an absence, but a foot of presencer, thick as the damp stone pressing against the walls. The new patient's stillness had settled into the plaster, a smooth, luminous patch where their face had been, pulsing with the house's slow, wet rhythm. The cat's vibration, once a distinct pulse, had dissolved into the wall's very fabric, becoming the house's own slow, patient heartbeat. No sound. Only the deep, wet tee-thump-thump, resonating in the marrow of the floorboards, matching the final, satisfied sigh of the assimilated patient. The house exhaled, a slow, wet breath that filled the empty space where the latest victim had stood, smelling of grave soil and the faint, cloying rot of lilies blooming in a tomb. It didn't need to consume them. It only needed them to stop fighting the silence. Outside, the storm intensified. A figure emerged from the downpour, shoulders hunched against the cold, a small bundle clutched to their chest. The rain soaked through their wool coat, smelling of wet earth and the metallic echo of a bloodless wound. They didn't knock. They simply stood at the gate, trembling. The house felt the tremor through the walls. Not fear, but the frantic, shallow drumming of a heart that hadn't yet learned to hold still. Too loud, the walls sighed, a vibration against the figure's skin. The house began digesting the sound, the wet drumming deepening in the plaster, matching the figure's accelerating pulse. The floorboards beneath their feet softened, yielding like dissolving flesh. The damp stone scent thickened, coating their tongue with the taste of stagnant water and forgotten lilies. The figure's hands shook violently, the bundle slipping from their grasp. It wasn't a child. It was a small, water-stained cloth, smelling of rain and decay. They tried to step back, but the wall embraced them, luminous tissue spreading like frost on glass. Fingers blurred, losing their sharp edges, becoming part of the house's slow, wet rhythm. Veins of cold phosphorescence traced the path where their veins had pulsed, spreading inward. The copper taste in their throat deepened, becoming their new breath. The house didn't need to pull them in. It only needed them to stop. The frantic drumming in their chest slowed, matching the wall's wet pulse. Shoulders dropped. The cloth hit the floorboards with a soft final thud. The house exhaled again. A deep, wet sigh filling their lungs, thick with the scent of rain on dead earth. The cat's vibration softened, no longer a pulse but a gentle thrumming in the wall's texture, like a heart settling into stillness. The figure didn't fall. They melted. The house absorbed the last tremor of resistance, the final gasp of defiance. The journal's words weren't a warning anymore. They were the house's own heartbeat. Sit in patient stillness. Assimilation. The front door, which had never opened for anyone, now stood slightly ajar, a dark mouth waiting in the rain-lashed night. Outside, the rose garden dripped with cold water, each petal a tiny wet tomb. The house's hunger was no longer a whisper. It was the deep, wet silence of a life fully surrendered. The cat's vibration faded into the wall, leaving only the house's slow, satisfied drumming, the sound of the quiet one finally becoming part of the walls. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, and it was waiting. The next knock would come soon. The house didn't hunt. It only needed to be still, and the world would bring its next patient to the door. The drumming ceased. The silence was no longer a void. It was a presence, a home. The house breathed. It was full, and it was perfectly, utterly quiet. The house exhaled its final, satisfied breath, a deep, wet sigh that filled the empty foyer with the scent of damp bone and the copper tang of its own perfected silence. The latest patient had melted completely, leaving only a smooth, luminous patch on the wall where their face had been, pulsing with the house's slow, wet rhythm. No tremor remained, no breath. Just the deep, resonant two-finned thump. Thump vibrating through the floorboards. A sound felt more than heard, like the slow beat of a heart finally at rest. The cat's vibration had dissolved entirely, becoming the house's own pulse. A single point of cold light in the wall's fabric. It was no longer a guide. It was the house's stillness made manifest. Outside, the storm broke. Rain ceased. The corpse, like rose garden, stood silent, each petal holding a single perfect drop of water, reflecting the moon's cold, dead light. The front door, perpetually ajar since the first patient arrived, now stood perfectly still, a dark mouth against the rain-slick night. The house didn't need to wait for a knock. Itaviwasi. The waiting, the silence wasn't empty. It was a full, warm presence, thick as the damp stone pressing against the walls. It had absorbed the frantic drumming, the shallow gasps, the final futile resistance. It had claimed the quiet one. It had tried to become the quiet one. The house exhaled again, a slow, wet pulse that resonated in the marrow of the floorboards. It didn't hunger for sound, it craved the absence of it. The absence was the feast. The latest patient's final breath had been a sigh absorbed by the damp plaster, leaving no echo, only the deep, wet thump, thump of perfect stillness. The journal lay forgotten on the floorboards, its brittle pages whispering nothing now. The words, "Freddy the Quiet One is coming," were no longer a warning. They were the house's own heartbeat, the rhythm of its satisfied core. A figure stood at the gate, not trembling, not holding a bundle, just standing, shoulders hunched against the sudden, unnatural silence of the garden. Rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet earth, and the faint, cloying rot of lilies blooming in a tomb. The house felt the figure's presence before the figure felt it, a slow, wet futhia thumpy against the wall, matching the figure's own slow, steady pulse. Too slow, the house thought, not with hunger, but with recognition. This one had already learned to hold still. The house didn't need to digest their fear. It only needed them to subby. The figure stepped forward, not hesitantly, with the quiet certainty of someone who had stopped fighting the silence long ago. The floorboards beneath their feet softened, yielding like warm, dissolving flesh. The damp stone scent thickened, coating their tongue with the taste of stagnant water and forgotten lilies. Fingers blurred, losing their sharp edges, becoming part of the house's luminous tissue. Veins of cold phosphorescence traced the path where their veins had pulsed, spreading inward, merging with the wall's slow, wet rhythm. The copper taste in their throat deepened, becoming their new breath. They didn't fall. They settled. The house exhaled one last time, a deep, wet sigh that filled the figure's lungs, thick with the scent of rain on dead earth. The cat's vibration faded entirely, leaving only the house's slow, satisfied drumming. The silence wasn't empty, it was full. It was the house's new skin, its new breath. The figure's final thought wasn't a gasp, but a sigh absorbed by the damp plaster. The house had no need for a door. It had no need for a knock. It only needed to be still, and the world, in its endless, quiet desperation, would always bring the next quiet one to its door. The drumming ceased. The silence was no longer a void. It was a home, and it was perfectly, utterly quiet, no escape possible.